Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking what I can only describe as an absolutely unbelievable geopolitical thriller. We're talking about a story that's packed with international espionage, drug cartels, a massive military invasion, and a completely unprecedented courtroom drama. It's the story of Manuel Noriega, the de facto military leader of Panama, and his spectacular head-on collision with the United States legal system.
So here's a question for you. Has a foreign leader ever been convicted in a US court? I mean, just think about the sheer logistical nightmare of that concept for a second. To actually put a foreign dictator on trial in an American federal court, you're crossing incredible boundaries of international law, diplomacy, and military force. Imagine the diplomatic red tape, the geopolitical fallout, and yet, as we're going to explore today, this wild historical legal reality actually happened.
All right, Section 1, the making of a dictator. To really grasp this courtroom drama, we've got to go back to the beginning, because Noriega certainly didn't start out as a dictator. After growing up in a poor section of Panama City, he accepted a military scholarship in Peru. And it was actually there that he was first recruited to provide intelligence to American agents. By 1962, he gets officially commissioned into the Panamanian National Guard, and from there, his climb to power just takes off. In 1967, he's getting specialized intelligence, counterintelligence, and psyops training directly from the US at the School of the Americas. A year later, he helps pull off a military coup that brings Colonel Omar Torrijos to power, eventually becoming his right-hand man. Then, Torrijos dies in a really mysterious helicopter crash in 1981. Noriega expertly maneuvers through that political vacuum, and by 1983, he has totally reorganized the military and assumed absolute, unchallenged control of Panama.
Moving on to Section 2, the CIA's double agent. And this brings us to the central irony of the whole explainer. The exact same superpower that ultimately hunted Noriega down? Yeah, they were the ones keeping him on their payroll for decades. The US State Department essentially nicknamed him the Rent-A-Colonel. And looking at his operation is just wild. On one hand, he was a vital US ally, providing crucial intel and actively helping the Reagan administration destabilize the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. But on the flip side, he was a massive liability. He was playing both sides of the Cold War. He was secretly selling weapons to those same Sandinistas, sharing classified US documents with Fidel Castro, and providing a safe haven for international drug cartels. $4.6 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. That staggering amount represents the illicit payoffs Noriega allegedly pocketed from the infamous Medellin cartel. Think about what that actually means for a head of state. In exchange for that cash, Noriega actively used Panamanian national resources, like airports and diplomatic embassies, to protect the cartel's cocaine trade, basically giving them a VIP pass to smuggle narcotics right into the United States. And eventually, this sheer audacity and double dealing just became too massive for the US to ignore.
Which brings us to Section 3, Operation Just Cause. So the late 1980s roll around, and that diplomatic tightrope completely snaps. We shift violently from covert espionage to an explosive breaking point. In 1988, a US federal grand jury formally indicts Noriega on drug charges. The very next year, a political opponent rightfully wins the Panamanian presidential election, and Noriega just flat out voids it. He refuses to accept the results. Then, on December 15, 1989, the Panamanian legislature explicitly names him president and actually declares a formal state of war with the United States. Just days later, Panamanian defense forces shoot and kill a US Marine. With American lives on the line and the administration of the Panama Canal at severe risk, President George H.W. Bush decides it's time for decisive military action. So, what was this military action actually meant to achieve? The US launched Operation Just Cause with 4 very explicit goals: safeguard American lives, restore the democratically elected government, and preserve the neutrality of the Panama Canal. But then there's goal number 4, and I really want you to pause and think about how crazy this is. The 4th goal was to physically seize General Noriega so he could face federal drug charges. It is incredibly rare in modern history for a global superpower to deploy a massive invading army with a primary objective of basically serving a criminal arrest warrant on a foreign leader. But on December 20, 1989, that is exactly what happened. Over 25,000 US troops poured into Panama City. The military easily overwhelmed the local defense forces, but Noriega actually slipped away. He took sanctuary in the Papal Nunciature, which is the Vatican Embassy. What followed is honestly one of the most surreal standoffs you'll ever hear about. US forces completely surrounded the building, but of course they couldn't legally enter an embassy. So they got creative with some totally unconventional psychological operations.
They set up massive speakers and just blasted rock music. We're talking bands like Van Halen and The Clash at deafening volumes continuously for days. They literally annoyed a dictator into surrendering. And miraculously, it worked. On January 3, 1990, Noriega walked out and surrendered to U.S. custody.
Okay, Section 4, a landmark legal battle.
The moment he surrenders, the guns go quiet, and the jungle warfare officially transitions into a high-stakes, incredibly complex courtroom drama in Miami. Chief Prosecutor Michael Sullivan really set the tone right out of the gate. He stood up in court and openly derided Noriega as a small man in a general's uniform who had single-handedly transformed his nation into an international cocaine trafficking hub. Noriega was staring down some incredibly heavy charges now, including racketeering, conspiracy, and drug trafficking. Now, as detailed in an absolutely fascinating analysis by the Penn State Dickinson Law Review, this trial presented some massive, unprecedented jurisdictional hurdles. Just think about the intellectual gymnastics required here. How exactly does a domestic U.S. court have the authority to judge the actions of a de facto head of state acting entirely within his own sovereign country? Well, let's translate that from legalese. The answer lies in a concept called extraterritorial jurisdiction. It basically boils down to this. Under international law, if criminal acts are committed outside the United States, but there is a clear intent to produce harmful effects inside the United States, the U.S. can legally prosecute you. The court found that the specific laws Noriega allegedly broke, the RICO Act and the Travel Act, were explicitly designed by Congress to apply extraterritorially. Because his alleged conspiracy aimed to pump multi-ton shipments of cocaine directly into the American market, the court firmly ruled it had jurisdiction. It didn't matter one bit that he never personally set foot on U.S. soil to commit the crimes. But Noriega's defense team wasn't going down without a fight. It was basically a high-stakes legal boxing match, and they threw every traditional international defense they had at the judge. First up, head of state immunity. The court's response? Denied. The U.S. government never officially recognized Noriega as the true president of Panama. They formally recognized Eric de Valle. Okay, round two. Active state immunity, which protects the official public acts of a sovereign government. The court blocked this immediately, pointing out that protecting drug cartels and pocketing millions in personal bribes don't exactly qualify as official public acts. Finally, they tried diplomatic immunity because Noriega used diplomatic passports. The judge simply noted that carrying a diplomatic passport for easy travel does not actually grant you official diplomatic status under the Vienna Convention. Denied again. Out of standard options, Noriega even invoked the Geneva Convention. He argued that as a captured military leader, he was technically a prisoner of war and therefore completely immune from civilian criminal prosecution. And I find the court's handling of this legal maneuvering truly brilliant. They basically said, all right, let's assume you are a prisoner of war. But then they pointed out a massive loophole. The Geneva Convention explicitly allows a detaining power to prosecute a prisoner for criminal acts they committed prior to their capture. So yes, he was afforded certain humane treatments as a POW, but it absolutely did not shield him from a federal drug trial. And as if the international law aspects weren't complicated enough, the trial also featured a totally bizarre media subplot. While Noriega was sitting in a Florida jail, his phone calls were routinely monitored, and tapes of these calls, including sensitive ones with his defense attorneys, were somehow leaked directly to CNN. The trial judge actually issued an injunction to stop the network from airing them. CNN aired them anyway, sparking this chaotic legal battle that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Eventually, the courts reviewed the tapes and allowed the broadcast, ruling them legally harmless. Why? Because Noriega mostly spoke in confusing, coded language that didn't reveal any actual legal strategies anyway. And finally, Section 5, the precedent and legacy. The courtroom drama finally wrapped up in April 1992. After a grueling 7-month trial, the jury came back with a verdict. Noriega was found guilty on 8 of the 10 counts against him, staring down heavy maximum sentences for RICO conspiracy, distributing cocaine, and violating the Travel Act. In the end, he was sentenced to 40 years in a federal penitentiary. But the ripple effects extended way past a single prison cell, and this is why this history is so crucial. $6 billion. That is the massive, crippling debt that Panama found itself buried under after he was removed. Think about it. Without the illicit drug money and the systemic, deep-rooted corruption holding the regime together, the country was left to completely rebuild its shattered economy and its fragile democracy from scratch. As for Noriega himself, his final decades were essentially an international prison tour. After serving his heavily reduced time in the US, he was extradited to France in 2010 to face serious money laundering charges.
Just a year after that, he was extradited back to his native Panama, where he'd already been convicted in absentia for murder and brutal human rights abuses. His health eventually failed, and he passed away in intensive care following brain surgery in 2017. He was 83. So, I want to leave you with a profound question. If a superpower can invade a sovereign nation, physically extract its de facto leader, and successfully try him in a domestic court using extraterritorial jurisdiction, what are the actual boundaries of international law? The conviction of Manuel Noriega remains a singular, astonishing legal precedent. It's a moment when military might and the rule of law blurred together in a way the world had never really seen before, and honestly hasn't seen since. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.